Hi, I'm Ameya, and you are listening to Far From Home, Stories of Forced Migration. As I learned from my interview with Ms. Horikawa, the 120,000 Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II had to find a way to cope with the most difficult situations. They developed a quiet motto, Shikata Ga Nai, which means it cannot be helped. It was the Japanese Americans' way of staying strong. They accepted what they couldn't change and focused on moving forward. But this quiet strength had a downside. While the World War II generation of Japanese Americans used this silence to survive, it created a barrier that made it hard for their kids and grandkids to understand what had happened. Many Japanese Americans refused to talk about their experience in the camps. They were dealing with the hidden pain, shame, and confusion about what had happened to them. Many went as far as completely shunning their Japanese identity. As a result, the Japanese language, customs, and other aspects of traditional Japanese culture were not passed on to the next generation. This gradual fading of culture over several generations is both fascinating and heartbreaking, and I had to learn more.
There you are. Hey, good morning. Very, very nice to meet you.
That's Dr. Ken Shimizu, a lifelong resident of California, who also happens to be my orthodontist, and a great storyteller. Dr. Shimizu's parents and grandparents, like Miss Horikawa and her family, were among several thousand Japanese Americans relocated to Heart Mountain, Wyoming during World War II. Dr. Shimizu graciously sat down with me to share his parents' story and how their experience affected his generation and the generations of Japanese Americans that followed.
When my brothers and I were growing up, this was, in the 60s and 70s, life was just kind of normal for us. We didn't go through it directly. And, a lot of times we didn't take enough time to talk to our parents about what, life was like for them.
Dr. Shimizu learned much of his family's history through his mother, though at times it was very difficult for her to share her story.
She told us a little bit about, some of her experiences in the camps, but I can tell it kind of hurt a lot of the men, including my dad and grandparents, that they just really didn't talk about things at all.
Dr. Shimizu's mother and father were teenagers who lived relatively normal lives in California with their respective families. But all that changed following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 1941.
My mom recalls receiving this evacuation notice nailed to a telephone pole in their neighborhood. They were given 2 days to sell whatever property or possessions that they owned before being processed. They could only leave with a single suitcase, and most families were forced to sell everything that they owned for next to nothing because there were no options. Years later, she would always get depressed on February 19th because that was the day they found out and said they had to leave.
Initially, Dr. Shimizu's mother was sent to the Pomona racetrack to be processed before their relocation to Heart Mountain, Wyoming.
She remembers spending the first few nights in the horse stalls, and she said they weren't even clean. Eventually, they were assigned to the Heart Mountain internment camp, which is pretty much a desert wasteland in northern Wyoming.
Adjusting to this new life at Heart Mountain for Dr. Shimizu's family was very difficult considering the harsh conditions and prison-like environment.
They lived in some barracks that were really hastily constructed, and my mom used to tell the stories that, it was windy all the time and the sand would blow into their bunks, and you just couldn't keep anything clean. It was freezing in the wintertime. There was no privacy because they had 5 or 6 families all in the same bunks. They hung sheets as room dividers, kind of latrines where, had no stalls in it, and she really was not having fun at all.
Eventually, the Japanese Americans learned to adapt to this new way of life. Within the camps, they were able to establish communities, schools, and even social events, such as dances. As it turns out, one of these dances proved to be a fateful one for Dr. Shimizu's parents.
And my mom tells me she actually met my dad at one of the dances there. So they were older teenagers at the time, And mom says he used to shave nicely and he was a good dancer.
Following the release and eventual return to the West Coast, Dr. Shimizu's parents, like most Japanese Americans who endured this dreadful experience, wanted to leave those painful memories to the past.
I think the main thing is most of them that had gone to the camp situation tried to put it behind them. And so that's why, after getting out of camp, I think they spent about 3 years there. Main goal was to get on with their life.
And for the most part, that's exactly what they did. Most Japanese Americans returning from the relocation centers wanted to get back to their normal way of life, just as it was before the forced relocation. But reintegration into American society came at a personal cost.
A large majority of the Japanese, however, it's kind of a cultural thing. They felt that it was their fault that they got there. And so that's why they really kind of divorced everything that was Japanese. And that was the sad thing. Some spoke English. Most of the younger kids did. Most of the older people just spoke Japanese, but it became less and less prevalent, I guess, in the camps.
For Dr. Shimizu, the relocation of Japanese Americans also meant the loss of something that would impact generations to come.
So my mom and dad's families basically lost everything. We have no photos, no family heirlooms. The biggest loss for my family, though, was the almost complete loss of cultural identity. So,
Like Dr. Shimizu and his brothers, and many other Japanese Americans who came after World War II, there was a clear message from their parents about adapting to Western culture.
I remember my mom telling me that her parents told her, "You can't change the way you look, but don't you talk this way, dress this way, or act this way, because that's what got us here. Become more like Americans," they were told. As a result, my brothers and I, we never learned the Japanese language, never experienced any of the Japanese traditions when we were growing up. It's kind of sad.
But as I listened to Dr. Shimizu describe his upbringing, it's easy to understand why his parents made the decision to adapt to Western culture at the expense of losing their Japanese identity.
We had moved to a neighborhood that was fairly integrated. Um, Half of my friends were Caucasian, some were Asian, some were, pretty much everything. And so we really never thought ourselves as a minority. And I kind of kid with some of my friends that I tell them I was about 12 years old before I realized I wasn't white, and that's actually true because we weren't white, we weren't Asian, or anything like that. We were just kids growing up. So I guess when I started finding out more and more about the internment that my parents had to go through, I felt actually kind of guilty that we had life so easy compared to what they had to suffer through. And, I guess that was their goal in life, was to make our lives easier than they had.
And it is due in large part to his parents' hard work and sacrifice that Dr. Shimizu was able to pursue a successful career as an orthodontist. He has been in private practice for many years and is beloved by his patients, me included. As he considers retiring in the near future, Dr. Shimizu plans on traveling more often. This year, for the first time, Dr. Shimizu will be taking a trip to Japan, and surprisingly, that decision was largely inspired by his patients.
You asked me before, what are my hopes from the interview and all of this that my parents have gone to, is that we don't lose our culture. I've always been kind of envious of a lot of my patients, that a lot of summers they'll go back to Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, or India and spend, 2, 3 weeks there. And I always felt so envious because we never did that. They're keeping track of their culture. They're keeping those ties with, the past. And my past is kind of gone. And my biggest fear is for my kids, it won't exist. And they have become truly Americans, which is, a land of immigrants. But don't lose that touch with the past.